Hello, AP Psychology students, and welcome back. Today we are continuing with the social psychology unit, but we are switching from talking about attitudes and the way that we perceive others and ourselves to talking about the impact of the situation. So this aligns with topic 4.3, the psychology of social situations, and today we will be discussing learning objective 4.3a, which is explaining how the social situation affects behavior and mental processes. We're going to do this through two essential questions. So the first one is, what social forces influence our behavior? And the second one is, what conditions make conformity and obedience more or less likely in a situation? So when talking about social influence, right, the first thing we want to talk about is just the idea of how our behavior can so greatly be influenced by the factors surrounding us, right? Obviously, we have our own personality, we have our own moral compass, we have our own goals and dreams, but a lot of our behavior is impacted by what's going on around us, what environment we're in, and what are the expectations of our immediate surroundings, right? And so in almost every single social aspect that we're a part of, there are social norms. So there are understood rules for appropriate and expected behavior in particular situations, with particular roles, when we do certain things, right? And we follow those because in general we like to fit in. So one of the ways that this can influence our behavior is through something called normative social influence. So normative social influence is when you are influenced to do something, right? To do a behavior or to act a certain way or dress a certain way in order to gain approval, right? Or to fit in, right? So this is a great example of any fad you've ever seen, right? Like you see people everywhere carrying these Stanley water bottles and you're like, what is the big deal with Stanley water bottles? To be honest, I have a Stanley too and it friggin' leaks, right? Which is so annoying. So like, why do I have one, right? But ultimately, like a lot of people that I was that I'm friends with had them. They all love them. I saw some influencers get them. I like the way they look, right? And so I bought one because everyone else has one, even though there might have been a better product available. The next way that social influence can impact our lives is through informational social influence. So this is where not so much your behavior changes to fit in, but it's like if you're in a situation, you don't really know what to do, right? So maybe you're at a dinner and you don't know which utensil to use, or you show up to a meeting and you don't really know the right way to behave. You basically look around and are willing to be influenced by others who you assume have accurate information about what's going on, right? So everyone's standing in line and you don't really know why, but like you just assume that they're all standing in line for a good reason, so you get in line too. Okay, so now if we're moving specifically to talk about conformity and obedience and how those both play a role depending on the social situation. So conformity is when we adjust our behavior or thinking to comply with a group standard. Now, what's interesting about this is that the group pressure or standard can either be real or imagined. So it could be that you need to dress a certain way to fit in. Or it could also just be a general feeling, like you're in a movie theater at a performance and everyone else stands up to clap, and like it doesn't actually matter if you stand up or not, but like you feel this imagined pressure to stand up too, so you're not like the only one not standing. So researchers in psychology have been interested in what impacts conformity, right? How can we increase conformity? How can we decrease conformity? And so one of the most famous experiments with this topic is the ash line experiment. So what you see below is two pictures of what the ash line experiment kind of looked like in its original form. So participants were asked to judge the correct length of a line, right? And as you can see, you've got the standard line and then the comparison lines. So all you had to say is the standard line like A, B, or C? Now, what the participants didn't know is that everybody else in the room besides them were Confederates, right? They were in on the experiment. And they were told to give the incorrect answer to see if the participant would conform to the incorrect answer. So then the question is, did they conform? Like, if everybody says that the standard line is the same as line A, would the participant also say that it's line A, even though it's very clearly line C, right? So what kind of results did we find? What they found is that about 1/3 of the participants gave the incorrect answer when others did as well. So this is not to say that everybody conforms all the time, or no people never do what they say, they never kind of stand up to the group, but just the idea that these people like really knew the right answer and still gave the wrong one just to kind of fit in with the group. So what are some of the lessons that we learned from these results? So conformity can be increased in situations when the group is at least 3 people. So through this research, we realized that 3 people and then up to 4, right, is kind of like that magic number that like once you get more than 4 people, conformity doesn't really change that much. However, the difference between 2, 3, and 4, those would be significant. So you need at least 3 people. The group's got to be unanimous. So if one single person in this experiment or in a group dissents from the group, right, then the person has a role model to dissent with, and so the conformity is greatly reduced. The group has a high social status, so you want to fit in, you want to feel like you're a part of them, you care what they think about you in some way. And the participant is made to feel insecure. So there's something about the situation where you feel like you might actually be wrong, or you might second guess yourself or feel bad about yourself. And so that can also increase conformity. And then last but not least, the participant knows people are observing them. So a lot of conformity has to do with the way that others will perceive you. And so there needs to be this aspect that other people see. If someone just tells you that everyone does this and no one actually sees you do it, then you're less likely to conform. Okay, so the next impact of social situations can be this idea of obedience. So obedience is different than conformity in that it has to do with complying with a specific order or command from an authority figure, right? So conformity is more about fitting in or getting along with the group, and obedience is more about a single authority figure kind of telling you what to do and then you complying with that request. Now, to be clear, not all obedience is negative, just like not all conformity is negative, right? There's lots of different situations where it would be useful to obey a command from an authority figure. So, for example, parenting, right? Parents' job is to keep kids safe, and so parents have particular rules that they use to keep their kids safe, healthy, all these free from harm, etc. Another example might be like the military, right? So there is this idea of like structure and organization and following orders that like gives some normalcy and control to what's happening, and allows an organization to run more efficiently and to run more safely, right? Because of this idea of obedience to a higher ranking officer. The question comes in is, what about unjust or ambiguous authority? So authority that isn't necessarily just or unjust, but is just kind of like there, or leaving it open to kind of some interpretation. So again, psychologists were interested in studying this idea of obedience and what it can look like and what can increase or decrease obedience to authority in a situation. So what they did is, what this study is known as the Milgram shock experiment, right? It was done by Professor Stanley Milgram. And what he did is he created this scenario where there was a teacher and a learner. So the person who was the actual participant believed that they were doing a study on if learning was impacted by punishment. So as you can see in this diagram, the teacher is the participant. So they're the only ones who are actually being looked at. The learner and the experimenter are both in on the experiment. The learner is a confederate, right? They pretended to be a participant, but they really were not. It was all kind of fake, right? Or not kind of fake, it was all fake. So what happened was the participants were told to shock the learner when they gave an incorrect answer. They were learning different pairs of words. So when they gave a wrong answer, the experimenter would say, now it's time for a shock. They would shock, and then the learner would say like, ow, that hurts, stop, right? They'd have some sort of response. And they started at like 5 volts of electricity and went all the way up to 450 volts of electricity. So the question is, would participants agree to shock, even with the learner asking them to stop or saying it hurts or, kind of protesting in some way? And as you can see, this is just a picture from the original footage, right? And as you notice, right, there's all these different small shocks all the way up to the largest shock at 450, right? So they didn't start at 450, they started at the one end and moved up to the other. So what did we find in the results? So we found, shockingly to many psychologists who wanted to give what they thought would be the results, was that 65% of the subjects continued to shock all the way up to 450 volts, right? This is labeled as XXX, severe danger on the shock machine, right? It's very clear that this would not be comfortable or it would be painful to the person. The people were screaming on the other side, the learner, and I remember this is all fake, but the participant doesn't know that, right? So what did we learn? We learned that obedience to authority increases when there's a legitimate authority figure. So the experimenter, they're in a white lab coat, they seem to be running the experiment, you seem to trust that they know what they're doing. the institution is prestigious. So this was done on a college campus. It had like a very formal setup. It wasn't like in some shady alley or something where you felt kind of like, what's going on here? The victim is depersonalized. So you can see that the victim, the person who was the learner, right, getting the shock, they were separated from the teacher. They weren't in the same room. And the task is increased over time. So this is very much a connection with the foot in the door phenomenon, right? Started at 5 volts, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, all the way up to 450, right? They did not say, oh, shock at 450 or shock at 300 the first time. So what have we learned from all of this research, right? We've learned that social influences are very powerful, that many people do not correctly anticipate their behavior. They think they would never comply, they would never obey, they wouldn't conform, and it turns out that given the right situational influences, most people are not very good at anticipating what they'll do, and they do the opposite, right? So they tend to obey or conform in the right context. However, individual control is not impossible. So there are lots of examples from the Milgram and the Ashline experiment and other experiments with that, look at conformity and obedience and the power of the situation that individuals can resist. That it is impossible, that it is not impossible to say no. Now, certain things make it more difficult, and there's different personality types that are more or less likely to kind of conform or obey. However, the individual's moral compass does matter. So social forces matter, but so do the individual, all right? And ultimately, it's a combination of both that can lead to various situations we see with social situations in society. All right, remember to stop here and make sure you can answer these essential questions. Today we talked about social influence, social norms, conformity, and obedience. That's all for now, AP Psychos, and remember, psychology is flippin' awesome.